Eleanor Grace Pendleton stood frozen as the church doors swung open, revealing her threadbare dress and mismatched shoes to the snickering townsfolk of Willow Creek. The year was 1876, and she had never felt more alone than in this moment, the moment her fiancé had sent his 12-year-old brother to tell her he'd changed his mind about marrying the odd Pendleton girl. The hushed whispers circled the small church like vultures. "Too bookish," someone muttered. "No wonder Thomas fled," another added. Grace, as most called her, clutched her small bouquet of wildflowers until her knuckles turned white, fighting back tears that threatened to spill down her flushed cheeks. "I believe everyone has said quite enough," a deep voice resonated from the back of the church. The congregation turned as one to see Mason Porter standing tall in the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the afternoon sun. The town's most eligible bachelor, a rancher known for his stoic demeanor and fair business practices, was the last person anyone expected to speak up. Grace had exchanged perhaps 10 words with Mason Porter in her 22 years in Willow Creek. He tipped his hat when they passed on the street and occasionally purchased herbs from her small garden to treat his horses. Nothing more. "Miss Pendleton," Mason said, removing his hat as he walked toward her. His boots echoed against the wooden floor, each step deliberate. "If I may have a word." Grace nodded mutely as he guided her toward the small antechamber off the main church hall. Behind them, the whispers grew louder. "Are you all right?" Mason asked once they were alone, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it. "I've been better, Mr. Porter," Grace replied, wiping a stray tear with the back of her hand. "But I appreciate your concern." Mason shifted uncomfortably. What Thomas Wheeler did was unconscionable. No gentleman would treat a lady so callously. Grace attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps he realized I wasn't worth marrying after all." "That's not true," Mason said firmly. The intensity in his blue eyes startled her. "Wheeler is a fool. Everyone in this town," he stopped abruptly, seeming to reconsider his words. "Everyone in this town thinks I'm strange," Grace finished for him. "The girl who prefers books to balls, who grows medicinal herbs instead of flowers, who speaks her mind too freely. I know what they say, Mr. Porter." Mason studied her face for a long moment. "I've always admired those things about you, Miss Pendleton." Grace blinked in surprise. "You have, indeed," he cleared his throat. "Which is why I have a proposition for you." "A proposition," Grace repeated, unsure she had heard him correctly. "Marry me instead, right now." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "Mr. Porter, if this is some misplaced act of chivalry, it's not charity, Miss Pendleton. I've been meaning to find a wife for some time now." His expression remained serious. "My ranch is growing, and I need a partner with a good head on her shoulders. Someone unafraid of hard work." "But we hardly know each other," Grace protested. "I know enough," Mason replied. "I know you're intelligent, resourceful, and braver than anyone gives you credit for. The rest we can learn along the way." Grace searched his face for any sign of mockery or pity but found none. "The town will talk. Let them." A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "What do you say, Miss Pendleton? Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Grace took a deep breath, considering the alternative, walking back through those doors alone, returning to her small cottage at the edge of town, forever branded as the woman Thomas Wheeler left at the altar. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, I'll marry you, Mr. Porter." Mason's smile grew. "Call me Mason." "And I'm Grace," she replied, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't quite name. When they emerged from the antechamber, the congregation fell silent. Pastor Williams looked confused as Mason explained their intention to proceed with a wedding, just with a different groom. "This is highly irregular," the pastor whispered. "So is abandoning your bride without the courtesy of telling her yourself," Mason countered. "Will you marry us or not?" The pastor glanced between them, then nodded reluctantly. As they stood before the altar, Grace could hear the whispers rippling through the crowd. Mrs. Thornton, the banker's wife, made no effort to lower her voice. "He's only marrying her out of pity. It won't last a month." Mason took Grace's trembling hand in his, giving it a reassuring squeeze as they recited their vows. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Mason surprised everyone including Grace by pulling her into a gentle kiss. "Let's give them something to really talk about," he whispered against her lips. Outside the church, Mason helped Grace into his wagon. "We'll stop by your place to collect your belongings," he said as they pulled away from the crowd of stunned onlookers. Grace's cottage was small but neat, with herb gardens surrounding it on all sides. "I won't need much," she said, packing a trunk with clothes and a few personal items. "Bring whatever you wish," Mason replied, examining her collection of books with interest. "My home has plenty of room." "Your home," Grace repeated. "I suppose it's my home now, too." "Our home," Mason corrected her, "and my ranch will benefit greatly from your knowledge of herbs and medicines." As they finished loading her belongings, Grace took one last look at the cottage where she'd lived since her parents died 5 years ago. "I never thought I'd leave this place like this." "Are you having second thoughts?" Mason asked, watching her carefully. "No," Grace said, surprising herself with her certainty. "I'm ready." Porter Ranch lay 3 miles outside of town, a sprawling property with a large 2-story house, several outbuildings and pastures filled with cattle and horses. As they approached, Grace's eyes widened. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It's a work in progress," Mason replied, but she could hear the pride in his voice. "My father built the main house, but I've added to it over the years." Inside, the house was well constructed but sparsely furnished, with little in the way of decoration. "I haven't had much time for making it homey," Mason explained, showing her through the rooms. "Perhaps I can help with that," Grace suggested. "I'd like that." Mason carried her trunk upstairs to the master bedroom, then paused. "I can sleep in the spare room if you prefer, until we know each other better." Grace felt a blush creep into her cheeks. That might be best for now. That evening they sat across from each other at the large dining table, eating a simple meal Mason had prepared. The silence between them was awkward at first, until Grace finally spoke. "Why did you really marry me, Mason?" Mason set down his fork. "I meant what I said at the church. You're intelligent and capable. Any man would be fortunate to have you as his wife." "But why today? Why step in like that?" Mason considered her question. "I couldn't bear to see you humiliated." "Not when I've—" He trailed off. "When you've what?" Grace pressed. "When I've admired you from afar for years," he admitted quietly. "Your independence, your knowledge of plants and healing, the way you carry yourself despite what others say." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "I had no idea." "I'm not much for words," Mason said with a slight shrug, "and I never thought you'd look twice at a simple rancher like me." "You're hardly simple," Grace replied. "You've built all this." She gestured to the house around them. A ghost of a smile appeared on Mason's face. "Then perhaps we've both been underestimated by this town." That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Grace wondered what the coming days would bring. Marriage to Mason Porter was nothing like the future she'd imagined with Thomas Wheeler. Thomas had wanted her to give up her herbs and remedies, to become a proper wife who focused solely on keeping house and raising children. Mason seemed to value the very things Thomas had dismissed. The next morning, Grace rose early and found Mason already at work in the barn. He looked up in surprise when she entered, dressed in a simple work dress with her hair tied back. "Good morning," she said. "I thought I might help with the chores." "You don't have to," Mason began. "I want to learn," Grace interrupted. "This is my home now too, remember?" Something like admiration flickered in Mason's eyes. "All right, then. Let me show you around properly." Over the next few days, they fell into a routine. Mason taught Grace about the ranch operations, and she began establishing herb gardens near the house. In the evenings, they shared meals and gradually learned more about each other. Grace discovered that Mason had lost his parents in the same influenza outbreak that had claimed hers. He'd been 18 at the time, left to run the ranch and raise his younger brother, who now lived in San Francisco. "It must have been difficult," Grace said as they sat on the porch one evening watching the sunset. It was, Mason admitted, but it taught me what I was capable of. I understand that, Grace replied softly. After my parents died, everyone expected me to marry immediately or move in with my aunt in Boston. They were scandalized when I chose to live alone instead. Why didn't you go to Boston? Grace smiled faintly. I couldn't leave my gardens, and I wanted to prove I could make my own way. She glanced at him, though I suppose I've failed at that now. I don't see it that way, Mason said. We're partners, not master and servant. Your knowledge is as valuable as mine. As weeks passed, their awkwardness around each other gradually faded. Grace found herself watching Mason as he worked, admiring the confident way he handled the horses and the respect his ranch hands showed him. One afternoon, a rider arrived from town. Jimmy Wallace, the blacksmith's son, brought news that Widow Jenkins was ill and asking for Grace's remedies. She says the doctor's medicine isn't helping, Jimmy explained. She remembers how you cured her rheumatism last winter. Grace looked to Mason, who nodded. Take my horse, he said. She's faster. When Grace arrived in town, she felt the stares and heard the whispers follow her down the street. As she entered the widow's home, she held her head high, ignoring the curious neighbors who had gathered outside. The widow's fever broke after 2 days of Grace's treatments. When she finally emerged from the sick room, she found Mason waiting outside on horseback. I thought you might need supplies, he explained, dismounting, and perhaps an escort home. On the ride back to the ranch, Grace noticed Mason watching her. What is it? She asked. You were magnificent in there, he said. The way you took charge, knew exactly what to do. Everyone could see it. They were probably just surprised to see poor Grace Pendleton doing something useful, she replied, using the nickname she'd often heard whispered behind her back. No, Mason said firmly. They were seeing what I've always seen, a remarkable woman. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Mason kissed her again, not for show this time, but softly and with question in his eyes. Grace found herself responding, her heart racing as his arms encircled her. Is this all right? He whispered against her hair. More than all right, she answered, and led him upstairs to what was now truly their bedroom. As summer turned to fall, Grace blossomed under Mason's quiet appreciation. Her confidence grew as she established herself as the ranch's healer, tending to injured workers and sick animals with equal skill. She expanded her gardens and began trading her remedies with neighboring ranches. Mason, too, seemed to thrive. You've brought life to this place, he told her one evening as they sat by the fire, her head resting on his shoulder. I never realized how empty it was before. We've brought life to each other, Grace replied, taking his hand. Their happiness was interrupted in early October when Thomas Wheeler returned to Willow Creek. Grace was in town, delivering remedies to the general store when she heard his voice behind her. Grace, is it really you? She turned to find Thomas staring at her with an expression of disbelief. She was dressed in a new blue dress Mason had ordered for her from Denver, her hair arranged neatly beneath a matching bonnet. Hello, Thomas, she said evenly. You look different, he said, his eyes traveling over her. Marriage agrees with me, Grace replied, unable to keep a note of pride from her voice. Thomas frowned. I heard rumors you married Porter the same day the day of our intended wedding. I could scarcely believe it. Believe it, Grace said simply. Was it true what they said? That he married you out of pity, the word stung, but Grace maintained her composure. Mason and I married because we recognized something in each other that others missed, including you. Thomas stepped closer. I made a mistake, Grace. I let my mother convince me you weren't suitable. But seeing you now, you should stop right there, Mason's voice cut in as he entered the store. He moved to stand beside Grace, his presence solid and reassuring. Porter, Thomas acknowledged stiffly. I was just catching up with my old friend. My wife, Mason corrected him, his tone leaving no room for argument. Thomas looked between them, noting how Grace leaned slightly toward Mason. I see, he said finally. Well, congratulations to you both. After Thomas left, Mason turned to Grace. Are you all right? Yes, she said truthfully. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. That evening, as they rode home together, Grace asked the question that had been on her mind. Did you hear what Thomas said about you marrying me out of pity? Mason's jaw tightened. People will believe what they want to believe. Is that what everyone thinks? Mason guided his horse to a stop and turned to face her. Does it matter what they think? Grace considered this. I suppose not, but I wonder sometimes if you ever regret your impulsive decision that day. Grace, Mason said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it, marrying you is the one thing in my life I've never doubted for a moment. The sincerity in his eyes took her breath away. Nor have I, she whispered. As winter approached, word of Grace's healing abilities spread beyond Willow Creek. People traveled from neighboring towns to seek her remedies, and many left with stories not just of their cures, but of the remarkable woman married to Mason Porter, how different she was from the awkward, overlooked girl they'd heard about. When the first snow fell in December, Mason surprised Grace with a gift, a small building behind the main house, purpose-built as an apothecary where she could work and receive patients. Mason, it's perfect, she breathed as he showed her the shelves he'd built for her bottles and jars, the large windows to let in natural light, the sturdy work table in the center. You've turned our ranch into a place of healing, he said. I wanted you to have a proper space for it. Grace threw her arms around him. Thank you for seeing me, truly seeing me when no one else did. I could say the same to you, Mason replied, holding her close. In early spring, they received an unexpected invitation. The mayor was hosting a celebration for the town's 30th anniversary, and the Porters were specifically requested to attend. I'm not sure I want to go, Grace admitted as she read the invitation. Her last memory of a social event in town was still the humiliation at the church. We don't have to, Mason said, but perhaps it's time to show Willow Creek exactly who Grace Porter has become. After consideration, Grace agreed. The night of the celebration, she wore her finest dress, a deep green that complemented her auburn hair, which Mason had insisted on ordering despite her protests about the expense. You're worth every penny and more, he'd told her when it arrived. As they entered the town hall, conversation momentarily halted. Grace felt the weight of every gaze, but Mason's hand at the small of her back gave her courage. They moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and inquiries about the ranch. Mrs. Thornton, who had been so vocal with her predictions of their marriage's failure, approached with a tight smile. Mrs. Porter, you're looking well. Marriage obviously agrees with you. Indeed it does, Grace replied pleasantly, when one finds the right partner. Later in the evening, the mayor called for attention. Tonight we celebrate 30 years of Willow Creek's founding, but we also celebrate the people who make our community thrive. He raised his glass. To Mason and Grace Porter, whose ranch has become not just a successful cattle operation but a place of healing. Grace's remedies have saved more than one life this winter, including my granddaughter's. A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd as glasses were raised in their honor. As they danced afterward, Mason held Grace close. Do you hear that? He asked quietly. Hear what? Respect, he said. They're finally seeing what I've always seen. Grace smiled up at him. And what's that? A legend in the making, Mason replied, spinning her gracefully across the floor. On the ride home, Grace rested her head against Mason's shoulder, content in a way she'd never imagined possible a year ago. Do you think they'll ever know the truth? She asked. What truth? That the marriage that began as your act of rescue has become the greatest blessing of my life. Mason's arm tightened around her waist. It was never just rescue, Grace. It was recognition. I recognized my future when I saw you standing alone in that church. When they reached the ranch, Mason helped her down from the wagon, but instead of releasing her, he drew her into his arms. I have something to tell you, he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice that she rarely heard. What is it? I love you, Grace Porter, not out of duty or responsibility, but with every part of me. I think I have since the first time I saw you coaxing life from that garden of yours, talking to your plants as if they could hear you. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. I love you too, Mason, more than I ever thought possible. Under a canopy of stars, they stood together, the odd girl no one understood and the quiet rancher who had seen her worth from the beginning. We've come a long way from that day in the church, Grace said softly. And we have a long way still to go, Mason replied. Together. As they walked hand in hand toward the house they'd made into a home, Grace thought about the whispers that had once haunted her. They no longer mattered. The life she and Mason had built founded on mutual respect, and deepening love had become its own kind of legend in Willow Creek. Not because of how it began in front of a church full of laughing townsfolk, but because of how it continued to flourish when no one was watching. In the years that followed, the story of Mason and Grace Porter became something of a frontier tale, how the overlooked young woman with her mysterious herbs and the stoic rancher with his vast lands had created something remarkable together. They welcomed 2 children, expanded the ranch, and established a proper clinic that drew patients from as far as Denver. And on each anniversary of their wedding day, Mason would present Grace with a bouquet of wildflowers just like the ones she'd been clutching on that fateful day and whisper, "Thank you for saying yes." To which Grace would always reply, "Thank you for asking the question."